I'm indeed an economist. I've actually specialized in international economics, and also I'm doing this policy analysis work. So Sitra is actually a think tank for the Finnish parliament. So we're directly controlled by them, but we're still fully independent to search what we consider to be important for the future. We did indeed a study on how to implement what we call a larger environmental tax reform. You'll pretty soon know why we're calling it a larger one. In Finland in 2019. After this, we had parliamentary elections. And actually, I'm very happy to tell that the Finnish current government is on, at this moment, doing an environmental tax reform for Finland. But before we go there, let's consider a bit why do we need an environmental tax reform. So we're very often, of course, concerned and talking a lot about climate change. But we need to remember that climate change is not the only massive ecological problem that we have at this moment. We're having equally big, if not even bigger problems, to be honest, with the overuse of natural resources and overgeneration of waste, and the loss of biodiversity, which is actually resulting both from climate change and from the way that we're using our natural resources and our land. So it would be best to actually tackle all of these ecological crises at the same time, and they all need, at this moment, very urgent and effective policy actions. When we're just talking about climate change, for example, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5, we're basically having 10 years' time with the annual carbon emissions that we're at this moment emitting every year. Well, we need action in all sectors. We're, of course, having the emission trading scheme in the EU area, which is covering part of the emissions, typically around half. So half of the emissions are considered to be what we call non-ETS sector. And over there we need national policies, but also we need to, of course, increase carbon sinks. And also over there we need national policies. Well, in addition, in order to tackle basically both biodiversity and the overuse of our natural resources, it would be good to try to promote circular economy business models. So models which are aiming to go away from the linear economic model that we have nowadays and try to get it more circular, so that the natural resources that we take are circling in the system as long as they can, and then they're getting back into the circle again when they're considered waste. Well, what we can do, we have quite a few options, of course, in domestic policies. We can do regulations, standards, just providing information. We can increase different types of environmental taxes, and we can increase different types of environmental subsidies. Or then we can do an environmental tax reform. So what is an environmental tax reform? Basically, it just refers to a shift in the taxation towards environmental taxes, typically in a budget-neutral way. I also mentioned over here that it's temporary, because the whole meaning of the environmental taxes is, of course, to lower the environmental damages. So, for example, carbon tax is there in order to cut down the carbon emissions. So any revenue from the carbon tax will eventually smooth down. But before they do, you do get additional carbon tax revenue. And what is really important is, what do you do with the carbon tax revenue that you get? So in an environmental tax reform, it's typically, for example, decrease labor taxes or other distortion taxes, or, for example, increase social transfers to low-income households. The whole meaning is that you can, first of all, with the carbon taxes, for example, speed up emission reductions. But then by lowering, for example, labor taxes or providing these social transfers, you could also support at the same time employment in your country and a just transition from a social perspective. If you're using environmental regulations to cut down emissions nationally, you have to remember that those do also have a cost. They're not for free. And if you're also, of course, just using environmental taxes, but you don't recycle the tax revenue back to the economy, basically, you don't get similar opportunities for supporting your competitiveness, for your employment, and this just transition. We're having at this moment already about 30 years of research on carbon taxation. And this kind of environmental tax reforms are considered absolutely the best way to increase carbon taxes. So it's just not just us, it's also, for example, World Bank, OECD, European Commission, which are recommending their use. So basically the whole idea is kind of communicational as well. So, well, we consider taxes to be kind of like a stick, and very often we are considering reductions in taxes or increase in subsidies to be kind of like a carrot. So you're communicating that you're basically selling sticks and carrots at the same time. So what did we do in 2019? We had actually two separate teams of economists. And they analyzed, first of all, how to actually increase still carbon taxes and natural resource taxes in Finland, and listed dozens of different options for that. So if you don't know, Finland was actually, of course, the first country in the world to introduce a carbon tax. We did that already in 1990, so over 30 years ago now. But we're still considering that there's actually a lot of different ways that we can increase even carbon taxation as well. And then we modeled 3 different types of packages of tax increases and tax decreases, so kind of package of different type of measures done at the same time, and looked at their economic and emission impacts, also with actually 2 separate economic models. Well, from the history, we actually do have quite some experience as well, and quite some research on environmental tax reforms. As I mentioned, it's been researched for 30 years. And for example, Finland has been also doing environmental tax reforms previously as well. They were just basically typically not called an environmental tax reform, but the elements were still there. Also, for example, in EU area, Sweden, UK, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands have been doing environmental tax reforms over time. Well, based on research on how did those actually affect the economy and emissions, it's been found that they do cut very effectively indeed emissions, and they actually increased employment previously. The GDP impacts again were a bit more varying, but often small and positive. I think the most classical example of how to do an environmental tax reform comes from Canada, from the state of British Columbia, where they introduced a general carbon tax at 2008. So they didn't have any kind of carbon taxation before that. And when they introduced it, they decreased labor and corporate taxes at the same time. And they also pay lump sum payments to low-income households. It's actually very funny. You can find also these advertisements by the road in Canada that you're paying this much for your energy taxes or carbon tax, and you're getting this amount of dollars back. So they're really kind of advertising it so as well that, okay, the carbon tax is now 11 cents, and on average, households will get back $300 this year and even $600 the next year when we're increasing the tax level. Well, there's also research on how did the Canadian system actually affect. So what was found is that, again, very significant reductions in emissions and also a positive effect on employment. From USA, there's, for example, this kind of modeling work, so theoretical work before they're introducing any taxes, where they use 11 different type of economic models and energy models to predict what kind of impacts a general carbon tax would have in the US in this kind of environmental tax reform system. And they also find that it's expected to reduce emissions significantly and actually also increase GDP. Also from less developed countries, there is example from Indonesia and Mexico, for example, on higher fuel taxes actually increasing low carbon investments and increasing also firms' productivity. Let's see if I can get to next slide. Yeah, there we go. So just to kind of summarize again, what exactly are the full objectives of an ETR. So the first objective is, of course, to get emissions down, but also to prevent other environmental problems, such as the overuse of natural resources or loss of biodiversity. And then, of course, at the same time, support, for example, circular economy. But you can also support your employment and provide, indeed, support for a just transition, and support, for example, for all the low-carbon investments and innovations that we would need. So the whole idea is basically to kind of mitigate the side effects of your medicine. So the medicine is carbon tax, which is there to fix our problems on the environmental side. And very often there's indeed been concerns on their impact, for example, on global competitiveness of energy-intensive and trade-exposed firms, or on the real income and well-being of low-income households. So when you're lowering other taxation or increasing subsidies at the same time that you're increasing the environmental taxes, you can actually mitigate these side effects. We did the 3 different scenarios where we actually did kind of very simple scenarios. So there are not any kind of examples for the Finnish government, for example, to really introduce this kind of packages. So with the first package, we actually just wanted to model what would be the impact in Finland if we're really trying to just increase environmental taxes that are faced by firms and corporations. And then we also lower some of the taxation that are directly affecting firms. In the second scenario, we were looking at taxes that are there to actually increase taxes for consumers and households. And in the last scenario, we looked at also fiscal measures to support circular economy models. Seems like I can't click. Oh, there we go. Good. So over here you have the full view of what did we actually do. So as I mentioned, we first of all listed dozens of different type of options to actually increase carbon taxation in Finland. So over there you're having various different type of elements. So for example, in the first scenario where we looked at taxes for firms, we increased, for example, or introduced a price floor for the ETS allowances. Then we're increasing CO tax for fuel taxation. We were taking away quite a few of the fossil fuel subsidies that we've been still having. So lower energy tax levels, for example, for peat, for coal in heat and power use, for diesel as well, and for light fuel oil. And we used to have an energy tax refund for energy-intensive firms to compensate for the increase that we had in energy taxation some 10 years ago. And in this package, we also took that one away. So how did we use the model how did we use the revenue that we get from these taxes in this particular scenario? We decreased income taxation, for example, increased social security payments. And then, for example, a really big thing for the industry, we decreased the electricity taxation for industrial users to the EU minimum. So the whole point is that electrification is also a major way to cut down your emissions in industry. So by reducing the electricity tax that we used to have, you can actually compensate also for the increases in other environmental taxes directly to the industrial users. In the second scenario that was aiming to look at the consumer effects and effects for different types of households, we introduced a lot of the same taxes, but then also, for example, a flight tax for passengers, but also for air freight, and a new type of tax which is based on the total global GHG emissions of all consumption products. So everything from what you buy from the supermarket, all food, also electronics, chemicals, everything was included, including also services. So building up a completely new type of tax that is based on not just emissions coming from Finland when we're producing things, but actually trying to address also the emissions that Finnish people are creating abroad in China when we're buying products from over there. There's actually quite a lot of revenue coming from that particular subsidy in our scenario. So there's quite a massive decrease actually in income taxation. We've been also including, for example, a removal of the car tax on low emission vehicles in order to promote also the low emission vehicles in Finland a bit more. And in the last third scenario, there's indeed, for example, additional taxes on natural resource use, on non-metallic minerals and on mining, a tax on waste incineration, and a tax on pesticides. And in that one, we also increased R&D and investment support for low emission technologies. So not for everything, but just for low emission technologies. Let's see. Very good. Now we get the next slide. Bit of problem. Sorry for that. So what are the results? We find that actually all of these scenarios would have a significant impact by 2030 to our emissions. So that's the red lines in all of the results. They would all increase actually our employment a bit. Those are with the green lines, and the GDP impacts with the blue lines are small but positive in the first two scenarios, which are modeled with the same model. And in the last model, which is modeled with a very different type of economic analysis model, the GDP impacts are actually very much correlated with the employment impacts. Well, what is important to remember over here is that we actually get these positive impacts on the GDP and employment only when we're recycling the environmental tax revenue back by reducing labor taxes. So we also tried different types of recycling the revenue back. So first of all, we tried not recycling it at all, so basically just increasing the public budget. Or for example, in the C scenarios, we decreased corporate taxes. And what you can see from those is that then we have just small negative impacts on GDP. Well, I do have to remind, of course, everybody that in these scenarios by 2030, the Finnish GDP is actually expected to increase by 38%. So having even 1.4% percentage points decrease on that one still means that our economy is growing quite a lot compared to today in all of the options. So when it comes to income inequality, what kind of effects did we get? Well, first of all, we have to remember that the effects of environmental taxes on income inequality depend very, very heavily on the details. So what tax do you exactly raise and how much? And of course, how do you compensate that? What kind of taxes or subsidies do you increase at the same time? So very often people think that, for example, fuel taxes are regressive, but actually in Finland, for example, they're not found to be regressive in general. So typically actually just low-income households living in rural areas are paying a significantly higher share of their income in fuel taxes. Then again, for example, flight taxes and this kind of general CO2 tax on consumption would really very, very clearly hit high-income households the most. So high-income households typically actually have even significantly higher CO2 emissions at the household level compared to low-income level households. So if you're really very consistently taxing all emissions, then it really means as well that this is really hitting the high-income households actually. But of course, also we need, for example, new low-emission vehicles, electric vehicles, We've been using some gas vehicles as well in Finland, but well, of course, we do know now that it seems that electrification is the way to go forward. There's been still a bit of vehicle tax on those, and if we now take that one away, for example, that will actually then again benefit high-income households because they're typically the ones who are buying actually new cars. And it seems that we don't actually need a big share of the tax revenue to compensate any kind of significant losses in well-being to low-income households. So actually in traffic sector in Finland, there's another study made, and in that one it was also basically concluded that about 15% of the tax revenue would be needed. And also World Bank said that the general finding is typically that maximum 12% would be needed to compensate the worst effects to the poorest households. But before you do any of these kind of environmental tax reforms, please do try to figure out in advance what taxes exactly would you like to raise, how much, and what are you lowering, because the impacts depend on those. So you also need to look at the social impacts, preferably before you implement any kind of proposals. Well, then how about the competitiveness impacts? Let's see if we can get the slide again. Here we go. So the whole point is also that environmental taxes can be raised without these negative effects on global competitiveness in this way. And actually, as an international trade economist, I do have to remind you as well that actually we're having very, very vast research results at this moment telling that actually firms' global competitiveness mostly depends on completely other factors than taxes or even their total costs. So most of the times we're talking about the image of the firm, the quality of their products. Why are we paying 600 euros for an Apple phone when we could get another phone with 400 euros? There's just a massive effect that the firm's brand and advertising and leadership is having on how they actually make it or not make it in the global markets. But of course, when you do consider just new taxes and also, for example, taxes on sectors which are a bit more having a bit more cost competition and price competition, the way to go forward is indeed preferably with an environmental tax reform. So, for example, in the first package, we really try to increase just environmental taxes faced by firms. We actually found that in all the industries, output and employment were increased, even though we had the substantial increases in energy taxes. And for example, in the energy-intensive sectors, for example, in paper industry, which has been the biggest exporter in Finland, we actually saw a large increase in their output and employment compared to not doing this kind of tax changes. So basically, they benefited a lot from the decrease in the electricity tax and also from the lower income tax, of course. Our total exports were modeled to increase in all of the scenarios as well. And of course, especially labor-intensive sectors typically benefit from reductions in labor taxation. And for example, you have to remember that very often these circular economy models are very labor-intensive compared to the traditional higher natural resource use models. Very good. So to conclude, basically, what I would like you to remember out of all of this. Well, the first thing is indeed that an environmental tax reform is absolutely the best way to introduce cost-effective environmental policies. Carbon taxes are by far the most cost-effective way of reducing your emissions. If you lower at the same time some other taxes, you can try to increase and tighten your environmental policies also in the way that is supporting your economy and actually creating a just transition for everybody. Well, very often people ask me, well, what kind of package should I make? And unfortunately, I have to tell everybody always that, okay, the selection of exact policies, exact taxes to increase and to decrease are political decisions. there is not really any kind of good economic guidelines on what exactly should you increase and how much, for example. So it really depends on what is your current situation and what is feasible and what is considered politically possible, of course, as well. As I mentioned, the whole idea of over here is also a bit of kind of communication side. So in addition to actually fully really supporting your household's income levels, if you, for example, lower income taxation, you can also advertise then the tightening environmental taxes in the way that you're really kind of selling the sticks and carrots at the same time. And then it's typically considered politically slightly easier, at least, to introduce the environmental taxes. And I do know that it's still never really easy. Well, the impacts then depend on the package of changes, as I call it. So what do you increase? What do you decrease? How much? And if you're increasing environmental taxes, please bear in mind as well that it's always preferable to increase them gradually. So don't increase your fuel taxes by 30 cents from this year to the next. Preferably increase them by 3 cents every single year for the next 10 years. And tell that in advance, communicate that very well in advance to consumers, to firms, so that they know already that, okay, these kind of tax changes are coming there. We're increasing gradually these environmental taxes, and then households and firms have more time as well to respond and try to actually, of course, avoid the taxes. But that's, of course, what we want them to do as well. We want them to go and try to find the new low emission technologies and ways to build to go from place A to B in the transport system, or to heat their house. Unfortunately, I also have to remind that there is no single environmental policy that can actually fix everything. So even if you're putting a carbon tax, unfortunately, that is not any kind of silver line that would fix absolutely everything. So most of the times we do see that we will need still regulations and standards and information guidance as well. And if you're trying to look indeed for good examples, of course, you can look at the very, very classical example, for example, from Canada, and of course also on what our current government has been doing since 2019 with their plans and with the implementation of this larger environmental tax reform in Finland. If you want more information on the topic, we're having actually even 2 different packages or reports that you can download directly from internet. Let me see if I can show you the slide again. There you go. So the report that we actually made, now I can hear the echo a bit, that's in English, just to make it easier, of course, for the international audience to read it as well. And there's, as I mentioned, there was 2 different teams of economists. So the other team made their own report on how to support circular economy. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any comments, questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Saara. This was both, you were having a very clear points, and the information was very systematic, so highly appreciated. I would like to pick up from where you left about the Finnish government right now implementing the ETR. And you said that it's a political choice which taxes to raise and which one to reduce. So what has been picked by the Finnish government, especially from the reduction side?
You mean on how to recycle the tax?
I mean, if you were saying that the Finnish government is right now implementing the ETR, and you said that when you raise taxes, on one hand, on other hand, you should reduce some other taxes, the income taxes you stressed. So, are the income taxes being reduced in Finland right now?
Very good. So what the Finnish government has been doing, sorry, I can hear an echo of my own voice again. Is there any, oh, very good, thank you. So what the Finnish government has been doing now is that they've been trying to look at the different ways to increase environmental taxes. So of course they did get quite a few ideas from what we modeled already for them. So actually directly, basically from the first package that we modeled, we were proposing a removal of the energy tax refund system that we used to have for energy intensive firms. And they removed that one now. And they actually subsidized that or then compensated that for the energy intensive firms by lowering also the electricity tax to the EU minimum. And also the lowest electricity tax base was broadened so that there's more fields that can actually get into it. So for example, these large heat pumps that can be used at industrial level were now also included in that system. I think it was already a couple of years ago when they also increased a bit the CO2 tax that we have in our fuel tax system at this moment. And that was compensated by lowering, for example, the income tax for the poorest households. So not yet for everybody, but for the poorest households. There's been quite some discussion and research ongoing on how to change the transport sector taxation in line with this environmental tax reform ideas. And there's, for example, a good proposal from the Ministry of Finance in Finland, but that is still ongoing. So there's still, of course, discussions on that. And of course, now the Fit for 55 proposal to have an emission trading scheme also covering transport sector is mixing, of course, some of the plans and everything needs to be pre-planned. And I do know that there's also now a study ongoing on how to implement, for example, this kind of larger consumption tax based on the global emissions, at least to food products.
Thank you for these real-life examples from Finland, and I see that the step-by-step approach seems to be chosen. We've got quite many questions actually, and one of them is about the sustainability of the ETR. That after you achieve your goals and the emissions go down, so then you need to find new tax bases or how to kind of deal with the question that you arrive at after the ETR has achieved goals?
So that is a very good question indeed. And as I mentioned previously, for example, in Finland, I can hear the echo again, sorry. We've been calculating that even if basically even if we actually reach net zero by 2035, which is the target, we're having massive carbon sinks. So it basically means that, for the next 10, 20 years, we're still having quite some carbon emissions to tax. But of course, after that, you do need to consider indeed that the whole point of carbon taxes is to erase the carbon emissions. And then, of course, also the tax revenue will go down. So that's why you need to also plan these tax changes. And of course, very often governments, you can change your taxes every year if you want. So you just need to kind of dynamically adjust all the time what you do. Well, for example, in Canada, they've solved this same issue in the way that they, of course, introduced new carbon taxes. And as I mentioned, they're actually recycling all of it. So it's a very, very classical ETR setting. So whenever, the carbon tax income will diminish, there's also just no more refunds back to the household. So it's very clear. Everything that they get back, they recycle fully back, and they're very transparent also to the larger public on how much tax revenue they get from CO2 taxes, and then they recycle all of that back. So, your educational systems, your health system is not publicly funded with environmental taxes in that case.
You emphasized that main negative effects in the ETR, like on income equality or on competitiveness, can be successfully avoided with this, like raising and reducing hand in hand of different taxes and measures. However, a budget-neutral reform inevitably entails winners and losers. In your scenarios, who would stand to lose the most?
So, for example, in the second scenario that was done for the kind of consumer side, it was very clear that the high-income households are losing the most. So there is indeed, of course, always trade-offs, and that's why I tell as well, like, we can't tell you a perfect way to do an environmental tax reform, because it depends on, you know, what kind of impacts can you and are you willing to take in your economy. And of course, if we're looking, for example, on the industrial or kind of sectors in the first package, it seems, of course, very clear that if you're lowering income taxes, typically the most labor-intensive sectors are the ones which are benefiting the most from that one. But still, as I mentioned, actually also the energy-intensive sectors, capital-intensive sectors in Finland benefited still significantly from the tax refund or tax reform, because we also decreased the electricity tax in the package.
The audience is also interested in the issue of tackling overconsumption. Did you have any separate emphasis in your work whether progressive consumption taxation in the ETR can actually tackle it and bring to more modest consumption rates in the future?
Yes, thank you. That's a very, very good question. So, of course, there's two approaches for it. So, of course, you can first of all try to look at how much a natural resource use are you causing within Estonia. And in that case, you can try to propose domestic natural resource taxes, for example, or just regulations or standards, whatever you see to fit most. So we had, for example, the non-mineral metallics taxes in our packages to support circular economy and the use of natural resources. And also, for example, the tax on waste incineration. But the other thing that you need to consider is indeed all the natural resource use that we cause in other countries. So what we are importing into Finland or Estonia. And this was also one of the reasons why we're considering this kind of consumption tax, a new one. So I haven't heard that anyone would have been actually able to make one yet. But it's an idea, basically, you're calculating or getting a good standardized data, for example, on the global emissions of all the different products. And you could also include into that information, for example, information on the natural resources use. And then you would tax the products consistently based on this kind of standardized information. Well, how much can you really tackle the overconsumption? Well, then it still depends, of course, on elasticities. So if you're, for example, having, we actually had a very nice example with our sugar tax proposal. So we were trying to, we introduced the sugar tax for a while and then was taken out, and they looked at how did it affect. So the main finding was that when it comes to just taxing all kind of candies and sugary products, there was not a lot of reduction actually still in the consumption, even when there was really a significant tax, because people saw that, okay, there's not a substitute for those. But for example, when it comes to sodas, so you're having lemonade or Coke, which is having sugar, and you're having, of course, an alternative, which is not having sugar. So just beverages without sugar, which still are refreshing. Over there was a significant decrease in the consumption of the sugar beverages, because there is a substitution possibility. So it will depend, product by product, basically. But for example, we know that meat consumption is creating a lot of emissions. We do now have quite a lot of vegetable-based alternatives for those. Some people will use them, some people not, but I do think that there's at least some kind of alternative protein sources which are less harmful for our environment nowadays. And also, of course, more in general, if we would get this kind of information for consumers, and also we force the producers to show that, we're actually affecting, of course, the producers' behavior as well. Because who wants to have, a label in your product that, okay, this is really harmful for the environment? If there's a neighboring product that will have a big sign that, okay, this is less harmful. So with this kind of just information, basically, you could already create quite some incentives, both for producers and for consumers, to reduce natural resources use.
Yeah, thank you for this example of the experiment with sugar tax in Finland. From time to time, the discussion also emerges in Estonia that should we have one, and you had a great example to do it as an experiment for a short time, and then to try to track what actually happened. I would like to ask one more, the last question, and although the time is already up, but it is important to know from your experience and from your scenarios, if the high energy prices hit the most low-income households, do you think that the tax reductions or the social benefits do a better job in alleviating this problem?
So for the absolutely poorest households, they typically don't have income. So if you're lowering income taxation, it will not affect them. And for those, of course, it means that you just have to increase the social security payments. But already for the kind of second or third income deciles, so not the absolutely smallest ones, it does help as well that you're lowering income taxation. But that's why I mentioned as well that typically you have to really model as well that what measures exactly will really compensate your household, so that everybody in rural areas can still travel to the supermarket and to their working place, even if fuel is more expensive, and they can still have a warm house even if heating is more expensive. And you have to really look indeed like how to compensate. And there's actually, for example, a lot of research ongoing in Finland as well on how to compensate, for example, in the transport sector to the poorest households. And it seems that there's different options for that. And it, of course, depends on what kind of systems you have as well. For example, with regards to social security payments. But it's not a difficult job, in my opinion. It just needs a bit of calculations and good register data, of course, and a bit of planning.
Thank you so much. I need to wrap up now. And it's good to hear that you have quite many interesting analyses are underway in Finland, so we should really keep an eye on these developments. And then thanks again, and wish you good luck with your further work. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saara.
Thank you very much.